let's take a look at parameter store. Now, parameter store is one of my favorite services to use because I have an operational and DevOps background, so parameter management and secrets management is extremely close to my heart and very important for secure application deployments. Now, Systems Manager Parameter Store, like we discussed, allows us to provide secure hierarchical storage for our config data and secrets. So we can store simple strings, we can store passwords, really anything that can be put into a string or numeric value can be placed as a parameter in parameter store. Now there's 3 different types. We have string, as you can see here. We have SecureString, so this is used for passwords. And then we have string list, and we'll take a look at all of these here in a second. So let's just talk about a string parameter first. Now a string parameter is exactly what it sounds like. It's a string value that we store as a parameter under a shared key. So we can see we have dev, database, user, and then we have our user1 value here at the bottom. Now another cool feature is we can look at the history of this parameter. So if I go in here and I edit this, and let's change this to user2, I save it, I go back in to check it out, and I go to history, we can see the different versions that have been made for this parameter. So this allows us to quickly identify who's doing what and when it's completed. Now we can also tag our parameter stores so that we can group it with our resource groups if needed later on. So I'll go ahead and go back to overview, and I actually want to go back to parameter store, and let's look at secure strings. Now secure strings are exactly what they sound like. It's a secured string using KMS, so the plain text value is actually encrypted and not visible. So it's important to keep in mind that anyone that's using these particular parameters need to have the correct IAM permissions or KMS key grants in order to decrypt the values. So we'll go to show value here, but you can see that right now it's hidden, it's not in plain text or visible in the console. But when I click on show, you'll see it gives us the value. And now what just happened is with the click of a button, we essentially use KMS in the background to decrypt this value and expose it in the console as plain text. And when I click on hide, it's doing the opposite. It's going to re-encrypt that value and hide it so we can't see it. Now, secure strings have the same history type, but you can see the difference here is we can decrypt all. So if I go to overview and I edit this, and let's just give this a new value here. Let's just say new password. I'll click on save changes. I go back in. We'll show it to make sure it's right. And let's go to history. So now we see our history, which we just looked at before, but this time we can decrypt all. So this is going to run a decrypt command for every version that's visible. And just like that, we can see our values. So a strong use case for secure strings are obviously passwords like we're looking at, or even SSH keys that you want to share as key values and import, or any value that matters for compliance. Now let's quickly have a quick demo on how we can use these in another service. So for this one, I went ahead and created a Lambda function just for this demo. So let me go to Lambda. It's our parameter store demo Lambda function. Now I'm not going to go over the code here, but I'm importing the Boto 3 client, specifically SSM, and then I'm pulling in a parameter value here, and you can see parameter with our dev database user value, and then I'm just printing it. So if I execute this, and we look at our logs, you can see user2. So that should be what the value is for this particular parameter. And it is. Well, let's go ahead and try this with a new parameter. So let me create a new parameter. Let's just call it prod password for now, just to make this easy. We'll leave the description blank, and we'll talk about the tiers here coming up shortly. I want it to be a secure string, and instead of the default key, I want to use a custom KMS key so that it's not automatically able to decrypt the value within Lambda. When you use the default SSM value, your Lambda functions can actually automatically decrypt those values without any grants. So that's important to remember. So let me go ahead and load up KMS here. And I'm going to create a new key just for this. We'll give it an alias. I'll click on next. We'll click on next here. And then I'm not going to define any key users. So I'll click on finish. And there we go. So now we have this key. Let me go back to parameter store, refresh, and let's select this demo. So let's go ahead and put password in here. I'll click on create. And then let's just go ahead and test this out in our Lambda function. So if I go back to Lambda, I edit my environment variable here. Let's save it. And let's click on test. Now you'll see it succeeded. Well, how is that? Well, what it's doing here is it's just pulling down the encrypted value. Now I can swap this here. If I change this to with decryption equals true, let's save it, and let's try this one more time. I'll click on test, and there you go. We get a failed result. And that's because we're not allowed to use the key that we use to define or create this parameter. You can see we are not allowed access. So that's how you can securely configure encrypted values in parameter store. Now this seems like a good breaking point. Let's go ahead and end this clip here, and then in the continuing clip coming up, I'll start diving into the last type of parameter, as well as the different tiers and how the hierarchical storage portion works that we talked about. Okay, welcome back to part 2 in this parameter store discussion. To start off, I want to talk about the string list parameter that we haven't covered yet. So once again, let's just enter our path here. We'll leave the description blank. I'll talk on tiers here shortly. And then we have our string list. Now this is where you provide a list of values in a comma-separated format for us to use. So what we can do here is I can enter Andrew for a username. We'll do Bob, and then let's do Jill as well. So we have 3 users in a list. I'll click on create. And if I go in here, you can see our list. Let me copy this name, and I'm going to use that same parameter store function that we used before. Now in between clips, I removed that with decryption equals true value so we can start using this again. I'm going to click on edit. Let's save this environment variable and let's test. All right, we see succeeded. And there you go. We now have our 3 users in a list that we just pulled from parameter store. So you can perform some type of action based on this list, like maybe we want to update some permissions for a specific set of users, and we can store that list of users in one location here in parameter store. So it allows for scalability and reuse of parameter values amongst your applications. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is I want to talk about the tiers. So if I go back in here, I create a parameter again. Let's just call this prod advanced. You can see we have a tier option. Now, the standard tier sets a limit of 10,000 parameters, and you can see they can only go up to 4 kilobytes. So they're limited in size and number, and we can't specify a parameter policy. But they're free. There's no additional charge to use standard parameter store parameters. Now, advanced, on the other hand, offer us a little bit more flexibility. We can create more than 10,000. They can be up to 8 kilobytes in size, so double the amount. We can specify our parameter policies, but another big difference is that charges apply to advanced parameters. And you'll notice you cannot revert back to a standard once it's advanced, but you can do the opposite. You can go from standard to advanced. You'll see it's the same types, nothing changes there. It's just now we have more characters that we can implement, and you can see that here at the bottom. So if I go to this one, the standard, you see 4096, and advanced has 8192. So immediately we're doubling the value amount by going to advanced. Now you'll also notice what you didn't notice in standard is a parameter policy. So if we wanted to, we could expire this parameter at a specific or relative time. And what's nice is we can also notify based on CloudWatch events with some specific settings. So let's say we want to notify before it expires 1 hour before. So this will send a CloudWatch event that we can alert through SNS if we desire. Now I'll click on disable here, and then I'm going to click on cancel. Now that's the key differences between a standard parameter and an advanced parameter. They're very key and critical differences, so be sure you know which one you want to choose for your use case. Now let's look at settings here. Now under settings, you'll see that we can set a new limit for our parameter store throughput. Now this is newer. It used to not be editable, but now we can go ahead and accept charges and then set throughput limits for our parameters. And we can also change the default tier. So if we just create a parameter quickly, we can say, hey, I want it to be intelligent, so choose depending on the request. I want it advanced by default or standard. So it allows some flexibility in customizable selections. Now the final thing I want to touch on here is our hierarchical storage. Now what this means is we can use path-based or hierarchy-based naming structures to control who can see what. So for instance, in our parameter store demo here, this has full access to SSM, but what we could do is I can go to parameter store, define these dev database values, create some dev application values, and then I can grant permissions based on that path. So if I do recursive and I do /dev and I search, we'll get everything with a /dev and then whatever's behind it. So we have database password, database user, and then users. So what we can do with this is we can specify an IAM policy that only allows that particular user or role to access stuff with this path, but not /prod. So it allows for segregation of privileges as needed. And then really, if we wanted to, we could also get down to the second level. So let's say we only want our Lambda function to have the prod application specific values. So if I do this and I search, now I forgot one level here, so let me go back. We'll do recursive. I enter the path here. There we go. We can lock that down to a specific path that we want all the way up to the last value in that name. So we can define this entire name here if we wanted to, or I can give it a path and give it some permissions to access everything under that path value. Now that's going to do it for this demo on parameter store and the different types of parameters. Be sure to play around with this as much as you can, as it's a free alternative compared to Secrets Manager, but there are some trade-offs that you have to be aware of. So do some research, play around, and then when you're ready, we're going to move on to the actions and change capabilities that we have in Systems Manager.